And it doesn't have to be for or against.
No, I
We didn't sign anything, so I figured I was.
Exactly.
Yep.
Is this on?
Yep.
Is this supposed to-
Hello, everyone. I'm not going to mic. I'm just going to talk loud for the beginning so that these two are ready. Mic'd. Thank you for coming today and for supporting Flyleaf Books. Your attendance in events like this and buying of books is what lets us keep having these events. So we really appreciate every single one of you who's here. This evening, we have the privilege to hear from Nicholas Dawidoff about his book, The Other Side of Prospect, a story of violence, injustice, and the American city. He is joined by David Dodson. Nicholas Dawidoff is the critically acclaimed author of 5 books, including The Catcher Was a Spy and In the Country of Country. He is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and has also been a Guggenheim, Berlin Prize, and Art for Justice Fellow. David Dodson worked as the executive director of the Cummins Engine Foundation in Columbus, Indiana, and then served for 2 decades as the president of MDC, a Durham-based organization dedicated to equitable change in the South. He continues his work on economic mobility and the causes of social disparities at MDC now as a senior fellow. We hope you enjoy the event. Thank you again, and remember, you can buy a copy of the book up front at the end of the event if you have not already gotten one. Thank you.
Early on the summer evening of August 1st, 2006, on a mournful New Haven side street, an elderly man from another town who just cashed checks worth nearly $2,000 was sitting in his cream-colored luxury car. A young stranger appeared at his window and killed the man with a single point-blank gunshot to the neck from a .45 caliber pistol. A .45 is a weapon so powerful it's a handheld artillery piece. Few people are murderers. Fewer still kill strangers. Far fewer, again, are capable of such an intimate execution. Another stranger, a 16-year-old boy who was blocks away inside a pharmacy, went to prison for the shooting. Whatever muted outcry that followed in the city was soon undercut by the settled belief that these were the things that happened. The conditioned insignificance of the crime carried its significance, and 3 men inextricably bound by violence was the gone grandeur of cities, the end of new beginnings, and old unresolved American history.
That's what we're here to talk about. So I'm going to start by speaking to Nikki, but also to you. But I'm going to look at this wonderful writer and say I want to congratulate you on this engrossing, sobering, inspiring story.
Thank you so much.
It's a story of hard struggle, of misfortune, of wrong choices, of persistence, of righteous advocacy on the part of people who've been harmed by systems they can't understand and can't control. So it is, it's such a compelling story of realities that many of us see from a distance, happily don't live in daily, and may not fully understand. And in addition to the stories of the 3 protagonists, maybe 4, there are a lot of protagonists in this, who come together and get so beautifully woven together, you tell this human drama against the backdrop of the story of a city that used to be a magnet for opportunity, for people who migrated from this part of the world looking to escape misfortune and bad treatment and limited opportunity, and a city which no longer provides enough of that for the people who live there now. So you've given us a human story, a civic history, and then little joke, this is my copy of the book. It's got all these dog-eared things, pages turned back, because you help us see these difficult to appreciate systems that are designed to protect privilege and then isolate and surveil less fortunate people, so the privileged, in this case the denizens of Yale University, are untroubled by trouble. And you do all that in a book that is not an encyclopedia. It's so beautifully written and readable. So I want to thank you. This book was a gift. And it turns out, dirty little secret that we just discovered last night, that Nikki and I actually discovered last night. We were neighbors, that we lived a block apart in New Haven. So this has special meaning for me, but I think here is a universal story that could have happened, did happen in New Haven, but these elements are probably happening even now in Baltimore or Philadelphia or next door in the New Haven of the South, which we call Durham. So thank you for this book. I want to ask first, if you will, what and where is the other side of Prospect? And what compelled you to dig into it and write this story?
Well, I will answer that question as best I can, but first I just really want to thank you for coming, and someone whose personal and also professional experience has so much to do with the things that I'm writing about. So it's so generous of you to take your time and to come, and I'm really appreciative. And I'm also, I just have to say, very appreciative as well to my wonderful cousin Jonathan and his family, his wife Ginger, who have been such wonderful supporters of this book. When I would come with my family to Chapel Hill and basically drop our kids here, and we'd go to South Carolina, which is the origins of where the families who are at the heart of this book came to New Haven from. They were such generous. They were such generous, in effect, aunts and uncles to our kids, and so we were really appreciative. And I also, just being here in this particular place, I have to just remember someone else who I had many conversations about this book with, which is my good friend Randall Keenan, who the heart gets heavy. But he loves this community, and he was a wonderful friend to many, many people. And he also loved this store. And I'm so grateful to this store for having me, as I am to independent bookstores all across this country, which are not only places of commerce, but they're places of community. And as a child, one of the ways that I got to know my city was by jobs, shoveling snow and raking leaves and mowing lawns. And then I'd go down on my bicycle downtown. I go to all the independent bookstores, and I'm probably, many of you are the same way. But when I look at the spines of those books that I bought in childhood that I still have, I see the bookstore and I see the people who sold it to me and who were from other points in the city who came there. And it's a very meaningful thing. So I guess I just have to say thank you so much for supporting this wonderful bookstore. As to your question, Prospect Street is a street that there's a sort of a hill, which is called Prospect Hill, and Prospect Street is the street at the very top of the hill. And on one side of that prospect, going straight down, are enormous and very beautiful houses. Some of the wealthiest families in New Haven live there, and it's always been, where at the top of Prospect Street is where, for example, the owner of the Winchester Gun Factory lived, and there are many mansions, and then going down are these beautiful houses. And on the other side is what used to be a working class community, which has now become a sort of a post-industrial community where there isn't a lot of work, and it's a very impoverished community. So the other side of Prospect, as a title, alludes, some of you may know that it's one of my favorite of Martin Luther King's speeches, where he talks about the other America. And in talking about the other America, it's important to notice that there are two Americas, and you're not saying which side or which America at any given point, but it's just so when I'm in New Haven and people say, well, which is the other side? And I just say, well, it depends where you are. One's always the other side. And Prospect Street is basically the invisible railroad track. And this is a big part of how American cities are constructed. I go on and on about this, but there's some places where they're, you could see the same sorts of things in Cleveland and Shaker Heights, or you could see in Kansas City, or in 96th Street, New York is often like that. But anyway, that's that. And I'll tell you really quickly how I came to write this book, which is, I grew up in New Haven, and in addition, how you know your city is and how as a child you get outside the very narrow confines of your small neighborhood is you have to be lucky to do that if there are a lot of kids. And I was lucky. I played baseball all the way through high school into college. And if you played baseball in New Haven with that frequency, as you advanced through the various age group leagues, you went from neighborhood to neighborhood because the leagues were in different neighborhoods. So every couple of years I was going to a different field. And so I was playing with different people. So I remember I went to public school until 7th grade, and then I got a tuition-free scholarship to a private school. And I remember that I was then playing Pony League, which is in Fairhaven, which is an old working class community, and it's by a housing project. And so every day I would go to school, and many of the kids had these big silver smiles. And I didn't know what it was for a while, and then I learned about braces and orthodonture. But then I would go to my baseball field, and if you play youth baseball, you know everybody on your team, everybody in the opposition, and the whole community that comes. And I played shortstop, so I was right in the middle of it always, so I could see everybody. And it occurred to me one day when this kid we called Rap came to second base, and he's standing there, and I look, and he smiles, he's got this big silver mouth like the kids at school. And it occurred to me that he was the only one. And I thought, that's something. And then a couple of years later, I'm playing at Bowen Field, which is in Newhallville, and I'm standing out at shortstop. And here, this is a community. I mean, my mom was a single mom. We lived on the rented floor of a 2-family house. My dad was severely mentally ill and often wandering around the streets of New York. And my mom didn't have a lot. She filled our lives with books. My sister and I, she gave us the 2 bedrooms. She slept on the fold out. But there was anxiety about money. And I was now standing on this baseball field where you just know, because you know people pretty intimately, that whatever struggles my mom had were nothing compared to some of the people who I was now playing baseball with. And I remember looking across the backstop and out at the expanse of this neighborhood and then up the hill to the top, and you could see it was sort of shimmering. Any kid who grows up in New Haven, towny kid, I mean, Yale is paradise for young people is our assumption, and it looks that way. It's just so lush and beautiful, and it does so many wonderful things for lives for young people, and we all knew that. But it was sort of, at that moment, suddenly it was, these things come to you at a certain point in life. I just remember standing there at my position, and there are these people all around me whose lives are really full of struggle. And it was so close. It was so abruptly just juxtaposed how close this very other experience was, this other America, in effect. And I just was thinking, how can this be? And that's really where it came from. So eventually, after many years of writing and living in Brooklyn, we moved back, and I went to work on this.
So this is quite a tale, and it is precipitated by the horrible event that you described here in this book. And one of your protagonists, maybe the chief one, Bobby, the 16-year-old, we root for him throughout the book. I mean, he is unjustly accused, convicted, imprisoned, but not destroyed, which is itself just a wonderful story. Tell us a little more about Bobby's travails, about his endurance, about his, I would say, redemption and attempts at re-entry into society, because there's quite an arc there that forms the substance of this book, and it's painful and inspiring at the same time.
I'll try to be more succinct than I was with the last question. I mean, so what I've told you about just now was basically an idea. It's a theme, but if you're a nonfiction writer, it isn't a story. It isn't a narrative. So I come back to New Haven, and I have to find a way to tell, in effect, about the lives of kids who resembled the kids that I grew up with. Because kids don't really, at least we didn't, talk to one another about the things. I mean, I never told a single kid growing up about my dad. And kids who I played baseball with, I mean, we talked about what was happening right there in front of us and what was going on at school, and we did not talk about personal things. And I wanted to know how it felt. And so but if you haven't, if somebody who has an association with the New Yorker magazine comes to a place as small as New Haven and starts going around and asking people things, you'll start to hear from people. And I got a call one day from a lawyer who asked me, if I would consider coming to talk to him. He'd heard about what I was doing. He had a law office on Whitney Avenue in the center of New Haven. It turned out I went to see him on a Sunday. It was a snowy day, and there he was up in the eaves. And he wore, I mean, his clothes were just full of holes. He was completely just tousled and just, I mean, he was all about these boxes that were all around him. And they filled up his entire office, and they were all had to do with this case involving this kid named Bobby, who he said had gone to prison at age 16 for a murder that he hadn't committed. But even more than that, he said that the circumstances of the murder and why this kid had falsely confessed to committing murder and why the police had pursued him, it all spoke to what he assumed were much larger concerns that I had, and it was true. And so soon enough, I'd met Bobby, and I got permission from the state corrections commissioner, who was also, for whatever reason, he's a pretty progressive guy, interested in all this. So I began visiting Bobby repeatedly. And what I would just say about Bobby is that if you falsely confess to doing the worst thing that one person can do to another person, it's that the most notable personal quality that I very early on sensed about him was that his integrity and that he was truthful could be confusing, except that I feel as though the more I learned about interrogation and confessions, and when you're 16 years old and you're unaccompanied by a parent and you're there with two large police officers and you're given a series of bad choices, if you can just get out of that room, you might do a lot, to make that happen. But in any event, I also thought that what Bobby really became was kind of an everyman in a way, because a couple of his other qualities are that he was particularly interested in the lives and experiences of other people and perceptive about them and sympathetic. And as a result, he would refer to himself as kind of a secret keeper for other people's vicious secrets, because people in his community were willing to confide in him because he was very empathetic and he was really understanding of, as he would put it, what people are going through. And I noticed over time about him that what made him also a really excellent subject for such is that he had not only understanding of many different kinds of experiences, but he had really beautiful recall of the experience of childhood. And this is something that is pretty rare on his level. And if you met him, he's a modest and unassuming person, and you might not have that sense of him right away. And I find that also in him a really appealing quality. And you couldn't spend as much time as I began spending with him unless you really liked him. He's very likable, and everybody in my family, I should jump ahead and say that about a year later, suddenly I got a call from the lawyer, and we were both headed for the prison, and I watched him be told by his lawyer that he was being set free, and then I watched his reentry over time, which is a whole, I mean, many people in this country at this point know all about the crisis of mass incarceration, but what mass incarceration creates is mass reentry, since just about everybody is released at some point. And so I saw really what prison did to him, which was, his childhood, the problems in his childhood that landed him there unjustly, but then what it's like, the experience of being in prison, which was ruinous for him as it is for many people. And then I was there with him on a day-to-day level as he began his reentry. And you might wonder, since this is a wrongfully convicted person who's exonerated, whether there's any difference in his experience than that of a person who has committed a crime and served their sentence and come out. And the answer really was no. That Bobby's reentry experience was entirely typical. If you talk to people or read books about reentry, you'll see that there are a series of things that you can anticipate happening. Not all of them usually, but one or two, difficulty in finding a job, difficulty in getting identification, sort of everywhere you go being assumed that, that you're gonna, do something again, which creates actually high recidivism rates. But, Bobby experienced pretty much all of them. And that was really the most heartbreaking thing, that here was somebody who, of all people, deserved real sympathy. 16 years old to go to prison on a 38-year sentence, get out after 9 years, but being in an adult prison and making the best of his prison experience, he really did. So this was, there's a lot of tragedy.
So you write about Bobby so beautifully. And as I say, we're rooting for him. We're kind of amazed that he comes out as unscathed as he does. Can you read a little in your words that helps us see
Sure.
Bobby? I know there's something about Bobby going into prison before he knows how to drive, and one of the milestones is learning how to drive. Maybe you're going to read that.
Yeah,
maybe not.
Exactly, sure.
Okay.
Good choice.
We have not
Bobby,
been smart.
when Bobby was a kid riding around, he was one of the rare kids from his neighborhood who was interested in the city. He used to call himself a traveler, and he'd get on his bicycle and he'd ride all over the place. And he was really interested in driving from the time he was very young. He used to go out for drives all over the city too with his grandmother, who was a very tiny woman, and she had many stacks of things under her when she drove. And she drove really, really slowly, which normally Bobby hated. But he really loved his grandmother so much that he tolerated both the radio station. He really thought she listened to old-timey music, which he wanted no part of. And, she was creeping along always. But he loved her. You need to know just a couple other things for this passage. One is that Bobby had an alleged co-defendant named Kwame, who was 14 years old when he was imprisoned. But he, unlike Bobby, had better representation, and he went to trial and was acquitted, where Bobby took a plea on legal. That was what his lawyer recommended. Kwame was completely ruined by the year and a half, though, that he spent locked up before his trial. The center of their neighborhood is a little store they called the 2-4, because it was open 24 hours a day. And this is where all young people in the neighborhood congregated, and Bobby used to hang out there, sort of the bright lights of the community. The prison that Bobby was, where he was called Cheshire Prison, or sometimes called Big Cheshire. And one of the two main interrogators who elicited his false confession was a police officer named Clarence Willoughby. So I'll just read you this little section. On any day, and this is after he's come out of prison, on any day when Bobby could again be a traveler, moving around, interacting with people, he was at his most optimistic. He wanted his life to permanently open up. Across the difficult first year after prison, the former boy on a bike now made earning his driver's license his top priority. Back when Bobby turned 16, his driver's license wasn't for him a defining American moment or even on his mind. Somebody could always come by and get you, he said, or buses, or your friend's mom or dad. We'd all pile in. Growing up in a disenfranchised community, many 16-year-olds from New Hallville didn't pursue their licenses. Glenn Worthy, the New Hallville native who was principal at Hill House High School, said, "When it comes up with kids, they say, 'Hush, Mr. Worthy, I don't want to talk about that now.' Mostly they can't afford it." Beyond the hundreds of dollars it costs to become licensed, many New Hallville families own no vehicle, making it impossible to secure a car in which to learn to drive, and then to reach the Department of Motor Vehicles, which was miles away out in the town of Hamden. There was also the reluctance to fail, sometimes felt by kids who'd already endured many defeats. Bobby's friend Shay described getting a license as extra stuff. Shay had been 21 and away at college when she finally got hers. She said that for New Hallville kids, there was no driver's ed class offered at Hill House High School, no way of getting to the high school in Hamden where such courses were held. Perhaps a license wasn't even necessary. Bobby's mother and father hadn't, so far as he knew, ever had licenses. A lot of people where I'm from ride around without licenses, Bobby said. This was a practice known to many in New Hallville as riding or driving dirty. Dirty was versatile slang with many applications. Shay said that everybody she knew growing up was dirty somehow. Suspended license, no insurance, car taxes. Let my insurance lapse because it was either phone bill or insurance. Food or insurance, which would you rather pay? Car insurance? That was let me pray. This is a lot of people, and you have to drive to make money at your job, so you take a chance. Bobby was determined. He talked about the driver's license as his golden ticket, said to him it means the world, because when I have my license, I can get a job outside New Haven where it's safer. Bobby's desire was to be upstanding, not someone who resorted to driving dirty, who remained unlicensed because he'd been in prison. He thought having the license would now finally make him feel liberated. Bobby's cousin Koya helped him to get the formal process started with a learner's permit. She and Granddad gave him a few driving lessons, then Shay took over. They had glorious times together out on the road. Shay loved to drive, and he did too. 4 months after his release from prison, Shay helped Bobby enroll in an 8-hour accredited course on safe driving practices, where he sat in the back row of the classroom behind all the teenagers and enjoyed learning about the potential on-road dangers of a messy car, about how passenger weight distribution affects turning radius. After completing the course came the qualifying tests, first written, then rode. Bobby went to the DMV in Hamden to take his written examination, and by the time he got to the DMV, he was visibly shaking. The atmosphere at the squat brick DMV building didn't help. With its uniformed guards, stale smell, the dulled faces of all the people standing by, the DMV could have been a correctional institution. Bobby began his test, and soon a question about skids slid him so far off course that he became rattled, rushed through the remaining questions just so he could get out of that room, get out of that building. He failed the test by 1 point. Afterward, he could barely speak. He was so crushed. The next available test date in Bobby's part of the state was at Cheshire DMV in mid-April. He could have waited a few days more and gone to a closer Connecticut town, one where he hadn't been incarcerated, but he was eager to defeat the test, and besides, Bobby felt no need to avoid Cheshire. His time there was someone else's mistake. He began studying the manual hard. On his second written test day, Bobby arrived at a coffee shop in Cheshire 3 hours before his appointment time, and he prepared like an athlete. He hydrated with water, he ate a banana, and limbered up with practice tests. He wanted a victory in Cheshire. He'd all but memorized the manual, but these practice tests asked for knowledge of the specifics of tire alignment and teen curfews, areas outside the manual's coverage. What was up with these non-manual related questions? When Bobby answered one incorrectly, he jumped up, nearly knocking over the table. On the way to the DMV, Bobby passed the prison. The Cheshire DMV was a much smaller building than Hamden and had the hospitable ambiance of a National Park Welcome Center. As he went in, Bobby was making nervous jokes and saying, "I'm not nervous. I'm not failing. I got this." His dark 26-year-old face contrasted with the rosy white teenagers who were arriving with their parents for the test. As the woman at the front desk signed him in, she took a practice glance and said, "You'll do fine." Then she advised Bobby, "Take your time." Once registered, Bobby disappeared down a hallway. 40 minutes later, he emerged, arms raised, roaring, high-fiving, cheesing. His test score had been nearly perfect. There had been several questions identical to those on the practice test. "It seemed like all the answers were popping out," he said, speaking in a joyous rush. "I'm souped, I'm turned, I'm ecstatic, I'm so souped." From the car, he made calls, left voice messages. Passing the prison, he brought up Detective Willoughby. "I don't bear him any grudges," Bobby said. "It's not my heart to do that. People can do wrong things and it doesn't make me hate them. I'm just letting people be who they are." Bobby would have to wait 3 months before taking his road test in mid-July, deferring his wishes he knew how to do. And he was so steadfast about license preparation, it seemed worrisome to think what would happen when there was no longer the upcoming road test to organize his life. He enjoyed practicing with Shay, she warning, "It's no more smooth sailing church drivers today, Bobby. Don't let anybody break your flow," which was not to say Bobby wanted the process to last. "I can taste it," he said. "When I pass, I'm going to cry. You'll see tears." The day before the road test in July 2016, Bobby drove around the city practicing what he judged were his weaknesses. He reminded himself to check his mirrors every 5 seconds, to note the speed limit, to place his hands 6 hours apart on the wheel. Near the 24-hour store in Newhallville, he said, "We were sitting there when they pulled me off the porch and arrested me. It was raining." Then he beeped a greeting explaining, "That was Kwame and them." Kwame's group was out there every day. Bobby drove so well you could forget he was practicing. Then, when he made a small mistake, forgetting to signal for a lane change, his arms trembled from wanting something so much. After all the waiting, everything happened very fast. A large, graying white man in sunglasses, a blue agency-issue polo shirt, and blue khakis approached Bobby. The man looked like a country boy state trooper, and it turned out Bobby's examiner was a retired suburban police officer. He asked Bobby to get into the driver's seat, to turn on the car's ignition, to use his turn indicators, first right, then left, to press the brake pedal. As the car crept out of the parking lot, Bobby signaled left, and something in the air lifted.
So, one last thing. There's the word, I think, liberated or liberation. This getting this driver's license is an act of it's a pathway to freedom. So the victim, Pete, who's murdered in the opening passage you read, his family comes to New Haven, the generation before, part of the Great Migration, seeking liberation. They sort of do okay, but by the time Bobby grows up in this very same neighborhood, the very place that was about liberation now is essentially about incarceration. I mean, if you're not in jail, you're still confined to the neighborhood, surveilled, watched. If you try to leave it, you're followed. So this theme of the search for liberation and entrapment, just seem to be themes that sort of go in and out in all this. Is that, at least that's what I got as a reader, that, you know, the dreams we all have of a better world sometimes are facilitated by the systems we count on, and sometimes they're crushed and defied. That's one of the takeaways I had, which made me think, how do we make things better for people who find themselves through no fault of their own in environments that, frankly, are designed to entrap them, or at least confine them? Do you have any thoughts about that? Having written this beautiful tale about people and about systems, what do you take away as thoughts about what we might do to change this, so there are no more Bobbies, or at least Bobbies have a chance at a better life?
Well, I mean, within the collection or the Venn diagram of words like liberation and freedom are a couple of other words that had a lot to do with what drew people to New Haven and all the other cities like it that you mentioned earlier, like Durham or Baltimore, or Philadelphia, or New York. And those two words that come to mind just now are opportunity and also promise. And for New Haven is actually, if you came to New Haven and you looked, you'd see that there are lots of South Carolina license plates all over New Haven, and plenty of North Carolina license plates too, because the relationship between those two states, primarily South Carolina, but then also North Carolina, and then smaller groups from Virginia or some from Alabama and Georgia too, is that this was the last of a series of waves of migration that this neighborhood really represents. And it started early, I would say in the middle of the 19th century, when people from Ireland came to New Haven, and Newhallville was an Irish neighborhood. And then it became an Italian neighborhood and an Eastern European neighborhood, primarily Polish, but also there was a Russian section. There was also a German period of time. And then during the Second World War, and this is late in the Great Migration, but Winchester Repeating Arms Factory and other, both munitions factories and other firms too, were really short on labor. And they began heavily recruiting from the states that I mentioned. And so Pete Fields' family, the murder victim, they came then to New Haven. And the neighborhood for them then was a neighborhood of opportunity and promise. And it became, the second, many African-American homeowners. And it wasn't just home ownership, it was also the possibility of something better. And many had jobs that were pretty tedious, but they were jobs that paid sufficiently so that there's a form of uplift. If you were dedicated to what you were doing, you could buy the car that you wanted to buy. Pete loved beautiful cars. You could buy a bigger house, first buy a house in Newhallville, but then Pete bought a succession of houses in communities outside New Haven that were increasingly big, where he could host. He made wonderful barbecue, and he loved to have people come for barbecue parties in North Carolina. Not North Carolina, South Carolina, that's quite different. And he sent his kids, to pay, could pay their college tuitions. What happens when these sources for people who have either been not well educated or didn't have a particular skill, these institutions like, for example, the Winchester Gun Factory, where you could come in and they would teach you a skill if you were, serious about your work and wanted to have one, that disappeared. So what is missing, in effect, is a post-industrial solution. And, this isn't to say that people all over New Haven, and I'm sure here too, and in many other places, there aren't many individuals, you being one, who have devoted a lot of their lives to thinking about these problems. But I always, when people ask a question like that, I think about something that President Obama used to say, which was he used to talk about the nature of problems. And he'd say that the problems that came under his purview were problems that had gone through all the other people who were supposed to solve problems, and they hadn't been able to solve these problems. So he got the most intractable problems. And he thought that that was a president's responsibility. But for whatever reason, among the most intractable problems, I think post-industrial communities haven't been per se identified as such. And I know that there are a lot of people who think about these things individually, but the problem is big enough so that it is, I think, a President Obama worthy issue because it's just too many people in too many communities across this country. And I think it's just too big for I know many wonderful people just in New Haven who've been doing wonderful things for Newhallville across generations. It isn't enough. These are systemic and complicated issues that when you take away that pathway, there needs to be something else. And I just think ultimately it's up to big institutions, whether we're talking about government or businesses or, for example, wealthy universities. And in New Haven anyway, way, way, way more wealth exists at Yale University than does for the city. And Yale's belief, stated public belief over a lengthy period of time has always been our business is education and research. And in fact, there have been various times where presidents or other Yale people have said the problems of the city are not the concern of Yale University because we have to do what our mission is. But I really think that, I watched very carefully as Yale responded to COVID and how beautiful it was to see how when there was a big problem, how people who are so gifted at what they did responded so quickly and with such agility and intelligence to join many other people in making tremendous inroads very quickly on a big national problem. And it just always seemed to me really counterintuitive and a little heartbreaking just as somebody who grew up there that the same wouldn't happen for this other kind of problem. So I always wondered, just for example, why there wouldn't be the largest institute for post-industrial studies in New Haven, because right there in your backyard was so much opportunity to do good. There are places that are beginning to think about these things, some more rapidly or with more determination than others. But I just think that these are really big problems and they require complex, sophisticated thinking for solutions.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for your insight, your humanity, which you breathe into the people in this book and have given us something really marvelous. And thank you for this talk. Let's see what these folks have on their minds. But first, may we thank our writer. Who has a comment or a question or a thought? Florence Nash.
You mentioned in the introduction that there were 3 or maybe 4 protagonists, and we've gotten a wonderful picture of Bobby. And now I'm really curious to know who the other ones are. I assume one of them is Kwame?
No, actually, I would say that the 3 main protagonists would be Pete, who is the victim, and so you will learn about Pete's childhood and as a means of talking about how the neighborhood is reformed again. The reformation of the neighborhood by this latest onrush of people who are showing up, and Pete's family is very much a representative family of that experience, and is a wonderful family. One of the great experiences of publishing the book was having a family book club with the extended Fields family where everybody read the book and then we all talked about it all across the country, some in New Haven, but many living many places. Anyway, so it's Pete and it's Bobby, and then the person who actually almost certainly committed the murder is a guy who's called Major, and there is an accounting of his childhood and his experience as a person who is a person of incredible potential and was such an interesting young person. I mean, he was the kid who in history classes, at the beginning of the academic year, if they were taught some pre-Columbian history, then later in the year when there was post-Civil War history, he'd be the only kid in the class who would make linkages between what he'd been taught right at the beginning of the year, which is what most teachers at that level would say they really seek from children. He's also the kid who'd come into school when he was a high school student and wanted to talk about watching the latest Ken Burns documentary with his teachers, which he would just do on his own. He's a really interesting person. He also became lethally violent and probably committed this murder. And how that happens is a complex and, to my mind, important story. But the main character I always thought of the book is the neighborhood. And so the voice of the neighborhood, it wouldn't read in any way this way, but when I think about great American books that are about communities, I had them just sort of in mind. I was always thinking neighborhood, so like Spoon River or Winesburg, Ohio, or books like that, where there are many voices contributing to a feeling of community. I interviewed over 500 people, and one of the reasons I did that is because I didn't want there to be just these individuals whose voices predominated. I wanted them to, the voices of many, many people to inform whoever I was talking about at any given moment.
Thank you.
There's also that great disheveled social justice 1960s lawyer in there. I mean, you've got all these ancillary characters who just it make a great opera.
Well, I just hope you would perform in it with your wonderful singing.
These are the singers out there. Who else has a comment or a question? And Nikki.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
You haven't said this explicitly, but I gather that every one of these main characters in New Hallville mostly is African American, and especially with the sort of tracing of the story from the South to the relocation there, and in your analysis of, what do we do about post-industrial urban America? What's your read on, how is race playing in the story? Now, obviously it's central, but I'm curious if you learned anything about race in writing the story.
I learned an immense amount about race, and I could say many things.
It strikes me that you were the white guy in the room for a lot of conversations.
Yeah.
To write this book.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's not only African American people who I was talking to, but there were quite a lot of them. And of the people in the book were Black people. And I think one of the things to notice is that just as much as it's a book about race, though, it is a book about poverty. And I was particularly interested in the relationship between a neighborhood where people were poor and a neighborhood where people were poor and Black. And one of the things that I spent a lot of time tracing was just the nature of poverty and violence. And what I would say is that there is a predisposition in some corners of this country right now, because the rates of violence are highest, especially when it comes to gun violence, among young Black men, to assume that this is somehow category specific to them. And one of the things I hope this book would really dissuade anybody who thinks that is to notice the history of the relationship between poverty and violence, that poverty is violent. No people are preordained to be violent. People learn violence by being exposed to violence, especially when they are young. But this is really something that I think it's really important to think about. That said, there are many wonderful things to learn about a community that leaves. I think it's pretty familiar to many readers what it's like when somebody comes from a country in Europe and it creates a community in another country and brings with them some of the old country recipes or just ways of being. Well, the same is true on a delightful level to this day in New Hallville and many communities like it. So if you walked up and down the streets, particularly true, still true now, there are plenty of people. I'll finish that thought and I will say one other thing. But there are plenty of people still in New Hallville who are proud homeowners who yearn for the neighborhood to be revived and uplifted and to become what they knew, who they consider the existence of the neighborhood as it is right now as a source of great despair. Because when they came in the 1950s and 1960s, you walk up and down the street, you could smell who baked the best sweet potato pie or the best pineapple upside down cake. You could see the guy who drove up overnight from North Carolina to New Haven, and in his back, he's a farmer, and he has a big bed of greens that he's grown because you can't yet buy the foods that people were accustomed to here, and particularly in South Carolina. And so he would drive up and he'd drive around his pickup yelling, get your greens, and people would run out and buy them from him. But there are also just many Southern institutions in that community, and the tie between the community and back home, as people would say, was strong. So there's a lot of, visits home and the other cousins coming up across the generations and things and finding jobs and so forth. But another thing I just wanted to say about how violence works in any community is even in the most violent American neighborhoods, most people are not violent. That it takes a tiny percentage, which is what it is, of violent people to create a real aura of fear and a sense of lack of well-being. So that, one way to think about it is if you live in a beach community and there's a shark attack, and then there's another one, how many people go swimming? Nobody wants to go swimming. So just imagine if you're in a small community where your agency is such that it's more difficult to get out of the neighborhood if you're a kid and you're kind of stuck in place, is the word that Patrick Sharkey, who's a wonderful American sociologist, uses. If you're stuck in place and there are people out there who have guns, which in a neighborhood where people don't have a lot of agency provides young people with a kind of warped but nonetheless a form of agency. If a lot of people have guns and you know who the people are who are really dangerous, this is terrifying. So this means that when you go to class, you're going to have trouble concentrating because you're scared. And again, most people don't get shot, but you might get shot, especially if you're a kid, because that puts you in closer proximity. And these are the kinds of things, this kind of fear, when coupled with many other, I mean, I could tell you about the more common criteria for people who, a lot of studies have been made in Connecticut prisons and where people report who are murderers, and I talked to a ton of young people who went to prison for murder. I could tell you about the different things that lead people to it. Fear is a big part, but being exposed to violence and then all these different sort of childhood adversities that lead up to this, for most people, it isn't something that they just suddenly decide to do. It's a continuum of both personal experience and then what you're exposed to. And even for Tracy Mears was a law professor at Yale who spends a lot of time thinking about policing and violence. She went and talked with big groups of people who were in prison. And she asked them to raise their hands and say, how many of you, these were people who were in prison for violence, how many of you have been victims of violence? Almost every single person's hand went up. It's important to notice that violence usually, not always, because it's a huge generality and one shouldn't generalize, but most of the people in communities who are violent know each other, and it's a network, that's her word, and Andy Papachristos' word, you may know him, he's another wonderful sociologist who studies this stuff, but they're known to each other and they are perpetrators one day and victims the next.
You have a character, I can't remember who it is, who describes Newhallville as simultaneously being under-policed, that is, it's not safe for the good people who live there, and over-policed, meaning everybody's under surveillance. And that just haunted me, that fact that good people aren't safe and all people are being tracked. What a horrible existence. So
since it's just something that is so much a source of public conversation and discourse right now, do you mind if I just say a tiny thing about policing?
I'm not going to stop.
You're so generous. So policing is something that obviously I wanted to learn a lot about. And I learned a lot of things that I couldn't possibly tell you all those things. But one thing that seemed really important to notice, so I was very lucky with this project. It wasn't just corrections. It was also every different kind of institution seemed very receptive to it. And I was, for example, when I went to talk to the chief of police in New Haven, it wasn't the chief of police under who all this happened. There had been an FBI investigation, and that whole police department there had been exposure of lots of corruption, and one of the police officers here who's involved in Bobby's interrogation, had gone on trial, and they had brought in someone who was a great exponent of community policing. And I'll just say quickly, community policing has to do much more with interaction. Instead of riding around in cars or relying on weaponry and so forth, it's intimate interaction between police officers and community. And this police chief said, you can talk to anybody in my department, but you have to know one thing about policing in case you're not familiar. That it's a very top-down profession like the military. And so I would recommend that you talk to people who have higher positions within the department first and move your way down, which I did. And I talked to, I would guess, between 40 and 50 police officers. And many of them were really, really interesting people. And I felt seems to be true nationally, having talked to a lot of police chiefs across the country and also read a lot about it, that most people get into policing because they want to be of public service. And that there is, to some degree, a little bit like shark attacks, that when one police officer behaves really badly, it has an enormous effect on the reputation of the whole department. Now, there's a lot of bad apples conversation right now, and I don't mean to say that, but what I do mean to say that is really true is that police departments are not monolithic. Every police department is highly dependent on that same hierarchy, and whoever's in charge as the chief is really important for setting policy and standards and expectations. And so leadership is crucial in policing, but also crucial is that it's too big and too empowered a profession to expect that when people who don't do that job well, and it only takes a few, when people who don't do that job well don't do it, they fuck it up for everybody. And this is among the police officers who I met who were around at the time that this happened, this was a source of tremendous despair. And at the same time that the police officers were coercing a confession from this person, truly awful, brutal, corrupt behavior, there were other police officers who knew that this particular detective had been empowered, and they were powerless to do anything about it, and they were praying on staircases within the department because they were in such despair of what was happening. So I guess one of the other things, just in answer to your question about, sort of what did I learn? One of the things I learned that is that as a writer or for anybody, if you make great generalities about any profession or any group of people, you're instantly in a lot of trouble. But not just generality about people, but it's also about how you conduct yourself in your professional work. So whether you're a doctor or you're a lawyer or you're a police officer or you're a writer or you're a teacher, what happened to these police officers is they got cocky. These were police officers who assumed that because one of them had grown up in the neighborhood and they had a really high solve rate and was being encouraged by the people who were his supervisors to solve cases as quickly as possible and was being financially rewarded at different times for having a really high solve rate, an outsized solve rate, actually an impossible solve rate for the number of people he's murders. He would be the first if he was solving that many murders. But because this was a source of real prestige among his supervisors, he became a real wild card and he became somebody who's truly dangerous. And this is the result of a dangerous police officer. But other police officers in the department were aghast, and they were, so it created tremendous morale problems in the police department for that reason. But I would also say that the police officers who I met who were most effective do what good teachers or lawyers or doctors or anybody else does. They listen. They get to know people before something bad happens so that when something bad happens, they have rapport with them and they're willing to talk with them they have the confidence that they can confide. And so if these police officers had known who the kids were who were out at the 2-4, and they had known who was really trouble and who was just a kid, this was not a complicated case. It was a simple case that got complicated.
Sir, in the black and white shirt. Yes, thank you.
Steven Spielberg's recent West Side Story had the story between the Sharks and the Jets, and there was police officer off the Cronkite who seemed to know everybody, the kids on both sides. When you're talking about community policing, is that what you're saying is missing now?
Well, I can't really speak. When I was a little kid, my mom used to play the West Side Story.
Like Steven Spielberg's version.
Yeah, of West Side Story.
It's a very different one from the one that we all grew up with.
Okay.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it, but all I can say is the police officers who were beloved in that neighborhood are the police officers who knew everybody, who were involved in people's lives, who...
Okay, so the other question, you said you're in Brooklyn now, in New York.
No, I moved back to New Haven to do this, so I had been living in Brooklyn.
Yeah, but because Brooklyn District Attorney, the new Brooklyn District Attorney has a unit of investigating cases and something about looking at cases and convictions in the past, and they came up with a whole unit of detectives in that unit that falsify cases, and then they have more than 100 exonerations because they discovered a whole series of falsified confessions. Do you know anything about that?
Well, it's just the person who used to talk about this all the time is a great question. Is Ken Rosenthal, who's the lawyer who takes on Bobby's case and spends years trying to get him exonerated. And he always used to say, well, if we know that this particular police officer has done this, why wouldn't we look at every other case that he's been involved with? And that usually, sometimes it happens, but as you say, but it's really, really rare. And people who are the Ken Rosenthals of this world are advocating for much more of that. because, slippage in a police officer in one case, and if your ethics are such that you are willing to do that once, how many times?
Yeah.
So what you say is really important.
We have time for one more question, and this wonderful red shirt has raised its red arm.
I just wanted to, as someone who's practiced law for 50 years, I can't help asking what the role of the prosecutors was in this. In theory, at least, there's supposed to be a serious filtering effect once the case comes to prosecution.
Yeah, it's a great question. There were, since Bobby takes a plea, you would think that the prosecutor's role was merely to accept the plea and get involved with sentencing and so forth. But Ken, the lawyer, was, if you read this, you'll see that there's just tremendous animosity between Ken and this prosecutor. And the prosecutor, as he's researching the case, the prosecutor becomes something that is like a source of inspiration, but a terrible source of inspiration, because he just loathes this prosecutor and what he did. And then it becomes clearer later on that the prosecutor and Ken aren't so different as people, that they're both pretty extreme, they have a lot in common in their backgrounds, but that the prosecutor, so I guess I would wander around because there's a lot to say. I would say a couple of things that are important to think about. I talked to a bunch of prosecutors. Prosecutors said that over time, sometimes off the record, that earlier on, it was impossible to do their work, and it was just an assumption of the profession that if you were going to prosecute somebody, you believed without a doubt that they were guilty, and that they were guilty, and you would never change your mind. The prosecutors I met were either rethinking that or trying to rethink it, but not successfully. And the prosecutor here, who takes Bobby's plea, but then also is the same prosecutor who prosecutes in Kwame and then loses the case when he's acquitted. This was a prosecutor who many, many people really wanted. If you were a crime victim, he was almost unbeaten. He was a formidable individual. So if you were a crime victim, you loved him. But in this case, and it turned out a few others, he was overzealous. And so what to say? He's I spent time talking with him about it. He said, well, look, you've come to see me. If I made a mistake, I want to know it, and I'd be horrified. But, I think ultimately the thing to think about with prosecutors is that there's this belief that prosecutors' job is simply to lock people up. And in fact, the prosecutor is the most powerful person because he's responsible, as you know, and every lawyer in the room knows, he's responsible for the entirety of the case. And really, really effective prosecutors, even as a case is proceeding, if they see that, that Bobby isn't actually the person who did it, if they begin to have doubt, a really brave prosecutor is the prosecutor who steps back and saying, it's possible we have the wrong person, we've invested a lot in this, but in fact, it's also my job to say we can't go forward. And so I think that Ken thinks that and many other people think too, Cookie Poland, who was Kwame's lawyer, they all feel that, that this prosecutor was like that police officer, so convinced that he was right, that he was unable to see the growing number of improbabilities in the case.
Thank you. I think, sadly, the witching hour is here, but what an hour it has been. Get this book. It's really good. And there are copies. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's really fun.
It was just I'm coming to say, hey, I'm going to call you.
Oh man, you should go through.
I'm coming in the spring. So
I hope you'll call us.
yeah, I will. I will. I'd love to. Thank you. Thanks for your question.
Thanks so much for
You're
coming.
welcome. Thank you for your question.
I work up at Yale Divinity School now.
So you know Anthony Campbell?